The recording is turned on. So, welcome everybody. Great to have a few minutes together here. And part of our webinar series we've been running here and trying to deal with current issues that certainly we should all be familiar with and watching for. We know that the world of cybersecurity is evolving quickly. We're seeing a lot of changes coming here, for example, related to new types of attacks and new types of approaches and tools being used. We have seen a rapid increase in the ability to modify an attack and modify tools using AI, which many of the hackers have found out can help them take an attack that has been stopped because we've found the solution, modify it, and have it re-released within a couple of days in a slightly different format. So this is something that is very much an issue for us today. But we have been familiar with risk management for many years. For many years, it has been the foundation of our security programs. Risk has been the foundation of audit, the foundation of physical security, the foundation of business continuity, and certainly the decisions we make for an information security management system are based on risk. And yet many people struggle with risk. But this session is not just to talk about risk in general, but really some of the areas that sometimes didn't get thought about or didn't get looked at when we did a risk management, and therefore can become a vulnerability for us as the result. So we're going to take a look here at some of the risk management blind spots that cost companies dearly, and certainly some of the approaches we take to address those blind spots as well. There's a couple of areas that we are going to look at here: the area of staffing, hidden dependencies, asset management, and supply chain. And myself, Kevin Henry, I've been in this game for a long time now. I do a lot of the teaching of various security courses, especially for Readynez. And so in all of this is a service that we are offering as hey, let's improve and continue to advance the profession of information security. So hopefully you find some good value in this short session we have together, but also from that, your questions, your comments are very welcome and so on as well. Something we'd be very glad to see. So when we look at risk, we often look at the most common frameworks, the ISO 27005. Now I say 27005 instead of 31,000, and the reason I say that is that my bias or my approach is usually looking at IT risk and risk related to information technology. And that's where ISO 27005 is a very good document. It shows us the steps and the processes of a good risk management methodology and has in it a lot of very valuable information about how to do threat modeling, to be able to discover vulnerabilities, how to assess and prioritize risk, so that we can support an information security management system like ISO 27001. But you do have another approach, and that is, of course, organizational risk. And that is where ISO 31,000 is really focused. It's focused on what is the risk to an organization, not just the risk to IT as 27005 is. When we look at, in reality though, every IT risk is an organizational risk. Organizational risk is much more than just IT, but every IT risk is also an organizational risk because that IT system supports business operations. That IT system is necessary for the business today to run. We realize that in many cases, there's almost no department that can run without IT anymore. And how that has changed in the last 30 years. It used to be very few people in the company had a computer or access to a computer. And that most things ran on, should we say, in manufacturing and so on, they ran on paper, they ran on manual processes, and which was fine. But now there's almost nothing that can operate if our networks are down or our IT systems are down. So this is a dependency of the organization on IT. And we need to make sure that when we do risk assessment, we really uncover some of the risks that might have been hidden, might have been a blind spot, something I didn't think of. And in many cases, it's not because people were sloppy. It's not because they weren't really trying to do a good job. It's just that there are so many things to think about. And the IT environment has changed so much in the last 10 years and is going to continue to change. That there might be things that this is what I know, this is what I've worked on, and there's things I just didn't know that I didn't know. So, and we can say here, we need to be diligent to actually discover risk. And that requires a special type of person in today's world. A person who is able to really dig at something and dig into it to find it. And hopefully then, once we've identified the problem, we can fix it. The problem is that I can't fix something I don't know about. And a problem does not fix itself just by ignoring it. So therefore, we quite often use a framework like 27005 to help us to make sure we were thorough. We didn't overlook anything. And beyond that, we have a couple of very good documents I like. Those are the NIST special publications. If you take, for example, NIST Special Publication 800-39, which looks at the whole risk management process, it very closely aligns with 27005 as well. The only difference is that at least the NIST Special Publication is freely available, at least not when there's government shutdowns. But the idea of really being able to use a methodical, structured process when we look at risk, so we didn't miss something, we didn't overlook. And that's why these documents are so good. You take, for example, in NIST Special Publication 800-30 Revision 1. That just looks at risk assessment. And just like 27005, has a whole list of threats, has a whole list of vulnerabilities. So that when I do risk assessment, I can check, did I consider this threat? Did I consider this one? Did I consider that? Have I really looked for, do I have this vulnerability? So there's a lot of good value in using these just to make sure I didn't miss something. We don't want to overlook something that could, of course, become a hazard or a really threat event in the future. The one thing I wanted to start with here, though, is maybe one of the more uncomfortable areas of risk, and that is the risk associated with the internal threat. Because we like, as people, to trust one another. We like, for example, to work as a team. And yet, organizations have become a victim of some type of a risk event because of internal staffing problems. And this is becoming actually, in some ways, even worse, because it can be hard to find competent staff. It can be hard to find people with the skills that we need, especially since the skills needed today are very broad. We can find a person who's really good at one thing, But that means maybe some other things were left out and weren't considered. And so we need to find what are the required competencies of our staff. And you take, for example, companies have spent a tremendous amount of money on technologies. And boy, we have some great technologies. Really, we do. The various vendors are selling us all kinds of security products that are really good at helping us to have the tools we need to do our job well. But what's the problem in many companies? They have a Lamborghini, a really good engineered piece of machinery, being operated by somebody who is still trying to learn how to drive a scooter. We have the tool, but we don't have the trained staff. We don't have the staff that knows how to drive a Lamborghini safely. And so this is where quite often the risks come, not because we don't have good staff. Yeah, the people we have are good, but they don't have the training they need. And in some cases, it could be that a person didn't even want training. Yeah, they're happy doing what they do, and that's fine. We need people to do certain jobs and just be happy at it. But we also have to make sure we can't have a football team or we can't have an ice hockey team where basically one person just wants to be in this position and that's the only thing they want to learn. No, you have to have forwards, you have to have defense, you have to have a goalie. You need to make sure you have full coverage of the challenge in front of you. And so this is where we quite often have to identify what the training needs of our staff are. And I remember I was doing an audit for a state court in the United States, and they had a really good land admin. She was keen, she was passionate, she was enthusiastic, somebody you would all want to work for you. But she'd become the land admin out of a clerical job. She had no technical background, but she was the one willing to learn how to initially change the toner cartridges in the printer, to clear a paper jam. And so she had this interest in technology, but she had not received some of the training she needed in order to, should we say, secure the systems. And they were vulnerable. The backup system wasn't working, and she was using modems to log in from home, and you can't do that on a production system without, of course, security precautions. So I said to her boss, I said, you have a really good person, but you need to train them. And he says, well, the problem is, he says, I'll give her any training she wants. She has to know what to ask for. And that's something where we're coming to the end of the year. For all of you as security managers and as security personnel, we should really look and say, what training does our staff need? What training do we need to make sure that we have the competence to drive the Lamborghinis, to drive the security tools we have today? And to make sure we don't have gaps or we don't have positions on the team that aren't being filled. So this requires us in many cases to, should we say, even push ourselves to learn things that we're not familiar with, to make sure that we have competence. And of course, the problem that happens in too many cases is that we have within an organization one person that knows that system. If that person gets sick or that person retires, there's nobody else who can fill in for them. And so therefore, that person is a single point of failure. And the problem is, as security managers, we're so busy just trying to get the job done. All of our staff has more work than they can handle already. That person who's going to retire 3 months from now, we say, okay, we'll get somebody to work with you. We'll do some cross training. We'll learn. And it comes to a few days before they leave and they say, you still haven't given anyone for me to cross-train. And a few days later, that person walks out the door and all of their knowledge goes with them. Why? We were too busy. We didn't make sure that, yes, if I'm going to have someone sit and learn this process, it's going to take away one of my valuable people from other important jobs. But it's far worse when that knowledge leaves and now we have a system that no one knows how to maintain. So a lot of our jobs as security managers, and I mostly work with security managers and so on, is to really manage our staff, to really be able to make sure we identify the skills that are needed. We take the time to ensure that they have those skills. A person, when you play a game like tennis, it's far more enjoyable when you're good at it. If you play golf and you can hardly hit the ball straight, it's not that much fun. But when we get better, it becomes more enjoyable. And exactly the same with our jobs. When we have better skills, we enjoy it more. We're more confident. And of course, these are some areas that we really need to address, that this is a serious risk for many organizations, because it is our team players that will make the difference of whether or not we have a really good security program, or do we just have a lot of good pieces that aren't properly integrated. The other issue is that we have too much of a lack of good documentation. We need documentation of how processes work. And when we look at, for example, just last week, we had the major outage with AWS. A few months ago, we had it with Azure. 6 months ago, we had a major failure with Google. Almost all of these come down to a lack of process. As pointed out, the amount of work it would have taken for AWS to avoid their failure last week was 3 lines of code. And having things checked before they were done. And so what do we need to do? We need to make sure we have things well documented so that if one person is off sick or so on, that somebody else can fill in. And yet, as IT people, we tend to not really respect the value of documentation. And we need to get better at keeping that documentation up to date so that we will be able to address some of these, should we say here, failures. And of course, as we look at by far the majority of problems we have today, they come down to things like misconfiguration. Why was the system misconfigured? It was a mistake. A person made an error, maybe because they didn't know. So this is one of our main risk blind spots, actually. And it's the one that we can actually fix most easily by really taking this season right now where we're going to do performance evaluations and really work with our staff and say, okay, what skills do we need to do our job properly? Can we really build a program so that everyone has those skills? And of course, it can even be, in many cases, should we say, a way to encourage retention of good staff. I had a person I worked with who was really competent, excellent potential, and yet she left the company. And why'd she leave? Because she was competent, and yet she'd been in the same role for several years. And her boss even said to her when she was leaving, the boss said, "I'm sorry," he says, "I didn't give you the opportunities to grow you should have had. So you're going to go somewhere else where you can grow. You don't want people to do that to you. You finally get a good person and so on, and yet we lose them because we wouldn't invest in helping them to develop and grow. And in many cases, when a person knows they can grow, yeah, they're very glad for that. It comes back in loyalty as well. There's another area of staff, though, that's less comfortable. And this is where staff does something wrong, and where we've seen cases of privilege misuse. We've seen 42% of attacks that have come from users who misuse their privileges, very often for financial gain. They were able to take information of the company and use it for their personal benefit, which they shouldn't have, of course. And we see that quite often users do that. And when we look at the reasons for that, as we see, 89% is for money. And it's one thing that we as security managers have to really watch. Do we have people that are exhibiting those behaviors that would indicate this is a high-risk person? The way that many security breaches happen is from people. A user who does something as an error, or a user who does something intentionally, and leads to, of course, a security problem. So part of this is that we need to work, even with the other managers in the organization, that we develop the ability to observe and to see when a person is exhibiting the behaviors that could easily lead to fraud, easily lead to them misusing their privileges for their own benefit. 5% of people, because they're just upset at the company, they do something wrong. So we need to watch for that. I don't think the 5% is something we can avoid. In many cases, people are going to get upset. There's always going to be a certain number of people that aren't happy. But if we can work with the 89%, then we probably have a higher chance of success or providing benefit. So what do we need to do? We work with employees and we watch the employees so that when we see behaviors, we look through the logs and we see a person looking at something they shouldn't look at. We look through the logs and see someone attempting to get access to a system they don't have the rights to. That we actually then intervene before they do something wrong. By looking through the logs, we see something and say, hey, do we need to talk a little bit here? Are you trying to do something that you shouldn't be doing? When they know they're being monitored. And in many cases, the point is then they're not going to do it again because they've had a warning. We can keep and preserve a good employee by preventing them from doing something wrong that would otherwise get them fired. So it's good to many times actually intervene, to actually step in. And of course, watch for misbehavior. The problems that, of course, in many cases, is that if a person doesn't have the skill or they don't have the recognition themselves of how to be thorough and accurate, then they make mistakes because they weren't careful enough. And we can see that a lot of the breaches have happened. We often see statistics that are very high. A breach happens because of insecure configuration, improper configurations. Other things we really need to watch for are we have all of these devices being connected to our networks today that are not managed by IT. Operational technologies, Internet of Things, building management systems, SCADA devices, industrial control systems, all of these are connecting now to our corporate networks, which is great. We have connectivity. But what's the problem on many of those devices? They have default vendor supplied passwords, default vendor accounts, and those become an entry point that could lead to the breach of our financial systems. We had 2 cases in 1 week where companies were breached because they put a new refrigerator into the employee coffee area. And that nice new refrigerator has Bluetooth and has Wi-Fi. You can manage it from anywhere in the world. Which, of course, when that got connected to the corporate network, and do you think they talked to IT before they put a fridge in? Do you think they discussed this with security, the fact that they're going to put a new refrigerator in the employee coffee area? No. And yet, here it gets configured, connected to the corporate network, and led to a breach of these companies' financial systems. Why? Because it becomes an easy entry point. So we need to really watch for these devices that are just being connected, many of them with, should we say here, default passwords and so on them that are commonly known. The other big issue always is dormant accounts. A person worked for the company and their ID wasn't removed. And especially when they are actually privileged accounts. But we see this in a lot of cases where there's been projects. We need to be better at identity and access management. These dormant accounts are an attack vector just sitting there waiting to be used. And we need to be diligent to make sure we really manage identity and access management. And so I know this little presentation didn't get into technologies and so on like you might have thought, because where is one of our greatest risks today? It's people. It is the blind spot that sometimes we don't see what a person does because, well, we like them. And we don't notice that there's a problem here. Where a person is so busy that they have not had the time even to take training and improve their skills. Where we have so many things outside of IT that now have become IT issues, the operational technologies. We also need to get better at restricting those who have admin level access on our systems. Because with admin level access, if they fall victim to a phishing attack, they can infect the system. If they don't have admin level access, they can't. And certainly a lot of this is about improving identity and access management, the access granting, and of course, revoking. One of the areas that is difficult is when a person intentionally commits fraud. And we can say here, in more than half of the cases where there's been a fraud in a company, it's because there was a lack of internal controls, or there were internal controls, but they weren't being followed. And fraud is a huge problem. The average cost of frauds of companies, when it's been found, has been 1.6 million US dollars. In Europe, it's about $1 million per fraud. We have statistics from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners that says organizations lose 5% of revenue every year due to fraud. And that's not net revenue, that's gross revenue. Every euro that we bring in, 5 cents was lost right off the top because of fraud. And this has been a statistic that's been around for many years and continues to be the same. So if we can get better at watching for the conditions that could lead to an employee doing something wrong, we can, of course, see as substantial savings. We also need to look for these hidden dependencies. There's a word in English that we don't use very often, but I really like, and it's called protection needs elicitation. To elicit is to draw out, to go to somebody and say you're going to do an interview. And what do you want to do? You want to draw out that what do they have to say? And in some cases, a good interviewer is the one who's able to get the person to open up. And for us, as risk managers, we need to be really good at eliciting or drawing out what are the risks. And that means that we have to look at things that might be hidden, such as, does our UPS have enough capacity to run our server room if there's a power failure? The UPS was put in 15 years ago, and we've forgotten about it because it's just done its job. But we go to look at it and say, ooh, this thing actually needs an upgrade. We've put in equipment that if we had a problem today, we don't even have enough capacity to run our server room. That's one of these hidden vulnerabilities that in many organizations. We also, for example, take a look and, well, we've put a lot of equipment in this room, and if we had a hot spell come through of warm weather, our air conditioner wouldn't even be able to keep this room cool anymore. That's a support system that maybe we did, as IT people, we didn't really look at. And facilities management didn't look at it. They just walk in and change filters and they're happy. They're not checking, for example, the capacity and so on of it. It's working. And we have an emerging risk here because of our dependencies on a lot of these infrastructure, whether it's water supply, electricity supply, gas supplies, and so on. We saw within the past year an increase of 70% of attacks against utility companies. And that's something we have to be ready for. What happens if we have an attack that here in Helsingfors takes out the water supply system? Are we prepared? If there's a ransomware of the municipal government here, for example, in Lund, will we still be able to run our business if there's, say, an interruption in infrastructure? And that's a hidden risk. But there's one last thing I really wanted to look at here, and that, of course, is old equipment. Because in nearly every company that's more than 20 years old, you have so much equipment in the server rooms and so on that quite simply we don't even know about. We don't track, and it's long past its mean time between failure, which of course means someday it is going to fail, and then we're going to have a problem. So this is something we have to become much more diligent, that we really look into what equipment do we have? Is that being properly maintained? And we can say here, having a good asset management database, and should we say become more diligent, that we know what equipment is in that server room, what protocols, what cloud-based services are we use, because we can't manage and we can't protect something we don't know about. So that's the main, should we say, risk blind spots I wanted to address here today. If you have any questions, I'd certainly be welcome and glad to answer those and so on as well. No, nobody's awake? So thank you very much, all of you, for the chance to spend a few minutes together. Hopefully you found something of value and makes you think about some things too. Okay. Any indication which sectors are more affected by fraud, insider threats than others? Yeah, a really good question there, Kim. Traditionally, there are two departments that are more susceptible to fraud than others, and that is finance and IT, actually. We have people within IT that unfortunately take equipment home they shouldn't have taken home, that have access to data that they use for personal benefit and so on. In finance, of course, that's where the money is. So those are sectors that we do see more likelihood of fraud. The one thing we do have to watch for is that some of the main problems are not the new employees. A lot of fraud and a lot of things are done by that employee who's been there 10, 15 years. And because they've become a little bit disillusioned, money's tight, and in many cases, they see that maybe somebody else got promoted and they didn't, with the result that they unfortunately do something they shouldn't have done. So we need to watch, especially those long-term employees, actually, because that's where many frauds actually happen.
May I raise a question?
Of course.
Yes. I was just wondering, I can see many mitigation actions on all these risks that you mentioned to mitigate the probability of these risks of occurring. But is there one of the risks you mentioned, or maybe more of them, where you actually cannot really mitigate probability or impact, but simply need a good plan B, contingency plan ready?
That is a really good question. The point is that I tell people today, do not think you can prevent ransomware. There are so many attack vectors, so many places where ransomware could come, that it's unrealistic to think that we could prevent becoming a victim of ransomware. Therefore, what you said is exactly right. What do we need to have? We need to have a really good plan B. We have to be ready for the day that maybe ransomware does hit us, that we have some type of, we can say here, attention to being able to be alert for if it could happen. So we detect it quickly, that we have a response plan that would allow us to be able to recover. We don't want to be the next Jaguar Land Rover, where a ransomware attack takes us offline for 6 weeks. And that, of course, you have to shake your head and say, how could they not have been more ready that it took them 6 weeks to be able to rebuild their systems?
Yeah, I
We
understand
need
that.
a plan
Yeah.
B.
So that plan B, I can imagine in the situation that you described, that needs a detailed script for IT, for management, for everybody involved in this. Would insurance companies be ready to take over part of that risk or not at all?
Cyber insurance companies have paid out a tremendous amount of money because of these sorts of problems. But the problems with money is it sure can cover for some of the financial loss, but it certainly doesn't address the problem of customer confidence, of reputation.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so insurance is important to have. But we also, I think one thing that comes because of what you said here, we need a good communications plan. When something happens, that we communicate, that people know what's going on, that they realize that we're dealing with the situation and there's an openness or a transparency so there can be trust, even though we've had some type of, shall you say, serious risk event.
Okay. Yeah. Got it. Actually, a bit similar to what you see that big world global brands like Coca-Cola, for instance, do. They have a marketing communication experts developing a script for the situation that one day somebody in a shop in some country pours a glass of Coke, and there's glass inside the Coke, and then the whole script start to run.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that, I would imagine.
Yeah. Um, And that is at least being ready for it so that we don't have to try to make up our response on the fly.
Sure, it's no, yeah, it's no panic plan. It's just there. The script is well developed and has to be executed on the spot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had another question come in here. Do you
Okay,
feel
good.
like it's a leadership management responsibility to help guide or steer new colleagues in their development when treading into the cybersecurity field? I can only speak from my own experience, and that is that cybersecurity is a really broad field, and there are a lot of educational opportunities that aren't always relevant. Absolutely. I completely agree with that, and I think that I'm reaching the end of my career. A lot of my job is to try to develop the next generation and hopefully help them develop in a good way. And for this reason, there's certainly a lot of education I encourage people to get that will give them competence and skills that are practical. But I don't encourage people to take a course, how to be a certified ethical hacker, because in most cases, that's not skill that is going to help them in their job. And sorry if I upset anybody who really likes the CEH, but in many cases, something like the CEH is fun, but it's not practical, it's not useful. So as you say, it's an educational opportunity that people take because, hey, this would be neat, but it's not going to help me to be a better security professional. If I want to be a pen tester, there's far better things to take to learn how to be a really good pen tester than sort of just as. And so I just use that as one example. But yes, there are plenty of courses that maybe are not the right ones to take. Take the ones that'll improve their skills. And if there's one thing I would encourage a lot of the junior people today to take, it would be in the areas of learning how to audit, learning how to examine, because we need to develop those skills to be able to examine and see something. That'll help us to be better at securing it. And I really like certifications that teach us practical, useful knowledge. And even one I think that's maybe underrated is the ability to deliver presentations, to be able to speak to management, to be able to put together a budget, for example. Our young people need to learn how to. I often say this in something like a CISSP class. I often say, our main job is not to be security professionals, it's to sell security. And we have to know how to sell that for people as well. Um, so anyway, I hope this has been valuable for you. Thank you for the minutes we got to spend here together. And certainly I wish you all the best in your careers. And for some of you I know, and others maybe we'll meet someday, certainly look forward to that as well.